The sun was cruel that day, pressing down on the dry earth like a punishment. Just outside the grand gates of the palace, where golden lions were carved into the wood and ivory tusks lined the entry, a girl was tied to a wooden stake like an animal. Her arms were bound with thick hemp, stretched just high enough to force her upright. Her knees trembled. Her head sagged under the weight of heat, pain, and shame. She was wrapped in layers of ragged cloth, gray and brown strips, soaked in dust and sweat. The fabric hung from her bony frame like mourning shrouds. Her face was half hidden beneath the folds, but what little could be seen was smeared with dirt, streaked with dried blood, and covered in the relentless buzz of flies. One eye was swollen shut. Her lips, cracked and crusted, trembled though no sound came from them. People gathered. They always did. Misery made for good sport. Children darted forward and hurled pebbles. One hit her temple, and she jerked, too weak to cry out. A little boy laughed and danced backward. Another child, emboldened, threw a fruit rind that slapped wetly against her chest and slid down. A few women watched with frowns, but said nothing. Men chuckled as they passed, making off-handed jokes. "Maybe she's mad," someone said. No, she tried to sneak in through the east gate," said another. "Told the guards she was born in the palace." "She did?" The first voice lowered. "With what proof?" "None. Just wild eyes and nonsense." "Then let her rot there." These days, everyone wants to be royal. The guards near the gates lounged with spears in hand, unconcerned. One guard plucked a mango from his pouch and chewed noisily as he nodded toward the girl. "She kept shouting at the High Lady," he said to his companion. "Called her a thief. Can you believe it? Her accusing the High Lady." The other guard chuckled. "Should have tied her tighter. Look at her, shaking like a leaf. One breeze and she'll be gone. Better that than her stink." They laughed. But not everyone did. An old man, hunched and silent, stood at the edge of the crowd. His eyes didn't leave the girl. He tilted his head as if trying to place something. The way she tilted hers, the scar near her eye, the faint chant she whispered under her breath, over and over again, barely audible through cracked lips. "She's not from the streets," he muttered, mostly to himself. A younger woman beside him glanced over. "Who?" The old man didn't blink. "That girl." The woman scoffed. "She's just another mad beggar. We get them all the time now." The old man's brow furrowed. No. I've seen her before. Years ago, before the change." The woman raised an eyebrow. "What change?" But the old man didn't answer. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat as if he'd just remembered something dreadful. He took a step back, as if afraid the truth might leap from the stake and bite him. Behind them, a palace window creaked open high above. A shadow passed behind the royal silk curtains, pausing briefly before slipping away. The girl shifted slightly, raising her head just enough for one bloodshot eye to scan the crowd. It was empty of recognition. Or maybe full of it. A hush fell. A single whisper, floating like smoke, slipped from someone's lips. No one was sure who said it first. "That girl used to be." The sentence ended unfinished. And the sun kept burning. Her name was Lima, though few ever called her that. Most knew her by the name the village children shouted as they hurled clumps of wet soil at her back, mud. It began as a joke and stuck like the grime that never seemed to leave her ankles. Every morning, her bare feet slapped through the alleyways of Kithra's Edge, through puddles that smelled of rotting cassava and the runoff from palace kitchens. Every evening, she returned home damp, bruised, and often smiling. She was small, lean, and sharp-eyed, the kind of child who could listen without being seen, who could vanish between two houses before a hand reached her collar. Her mother, Rena, was a woman of quiet sorrow and hurried hands. She carried herself like someone who once stood tall, but had forgotten how. Her spine bent more each year, as if the earth was slowly claiming her. She made a living preparing meals for laborers who worked near the river docks, and for most of Lima's life, she never spoke of the palace except to curse it in whispers. But there were clues. Above their cooking fire, wrapped in cloth, was a knife with a carved ivory handle, too fine for a river woman. On certain nights, Rena would touch her cheek where a faded scar ran near her temple, and stare at the flickering flames with a bitterness that tasted older than war. She never explained. When Lima was 5, she asked who her father was. Rena said, he was a shadow that passed too quickly. But when Lima asked again at 7, Rena snapped, ask the palace, perhaps they will answer what I cannot. From then on, Lima began to watch the palace gates. She climbed trees to see the gold tips of the palace towers. She snuck close to the drains behind the kitchen walls, where waste flowed out into the ditches. While other children played in the fields or helped their parents trade spices, Lima crouched near the gutters, hoping to catch glimpses of silk robes, shiny boots, and the muffled sound of drums during royal dinners. She convinced herself that the palace held her story, locked behind walls of stone and silence. The villagers saw her obsession as filth. Mud child, they'd say, shaking their heads. She'll drown in her own foolishness. One day, she followed the palace servants as they carried baskets through the alleyways. She trailed them too long, too close. One turned. Whose child are you? He asked, narrowing his eyes. When she didn't answer, another servant frowned. That one looks like, but he stopped mid-sentence and pushed past her, muttering a prayer beneath his breath. Rena found out and struck Lima hard across the cheek. You must never let them see you, she hissed. Not them. Not like this. Lima sobbed. But why? Her mother turned away. Because I already lost too much for being seen. Months passed. Then came the sickness. Rena began coughing blood into cloth. Her hands shook. Her breath whistled when she lay down. She tried to keep working, but one day, she collapsed over a boiling pot and burned her arm. That was the last day anyone bought her food. Lima became the provider. She sold stones painted like fruit. She fetched water for old women with bad knees. But it was not enough. Rena needed medicine, warm food, a doctor. One morning, Lima stood outside the east gate of the palace. Her hair was uncombed. Her dress was torn. She held a small gourd in her hands, extended outward like an offering. Please, she said to the passers-by. My mother is dying. No one stopped. When the high lady's carriage passed, Lima rushed forward and grabbed the hem of her silk. Please, just a coin. The guards descended like wolves. She was dragged away from the gate, beaten with sticks, and lashed across the back with a palm switch. Thief, someone yelled. Liar, shouted another. One guard spat near her face. They all say the same thing, dying mothers, missing fathers. You think the palace owes you something? She crawled home that evening, soaked in her own blood and tears. Her knees were raw, her hands trembling. Rena sat upright against the wall, too weak to rise, her face pale as smoke. When she saw her daughter's wounds, she didn't cry. She didn't scold. She simply reached for Lima and pulled her close. I tried, Lima, she whispered, breathless. I tried to protect you from it, from what they did to us. Who, Mama? The ones in gold, the ones who smiled while cutting out truth with their jeweled knives. Her eyes drifted toward the roof as her chest heaved. You were not born to beg, child. Lima's fingers tightened around her mother's hand. They took what should have been yours. That was the last thing Rena ever said. And as Lima washed her mother's body with river water and wrapped her in the only clean cloth they had, she whispered a vow. She would enter the palace. Not through the gutters. Not as a servant. Not on her knees. One day, she would walk through its front gates. And they would remember her name. The sun returned like a hammer. Weeks had passed since Rena's burial, and Lima had grown quiet. Too quiet. She no longer hovered near the drains or chased after scraps like the other children of the poor quarter. Her hair hung in dull ropes, her clothes reduced to patched fragments sewn with fishbone and thread pulled from rice sacks. But in her eyes was a sharpening. One morning, she stood outside the palace gates again, older now, perhaps by only months, but somehow changed. She clutched a folded bundle wrapped in palm leaves, her mother's final cloth, smeared with the faintest lines of blood and ash. She had cleaned it 3 times in the river. Still, the stains refused to leave. She waited for hours, unblinking, until a palace priest finally emerged. His robes were ivory and gold, embroidered with sun symbols, and his fingers were heavy with polished rings. Lima stepped forward before the guards could see her. "Please," she said, voice steady but low. "Please, I must speak to the priest." The man paused, narrowing his eyes at the ragged girl. "Why?" "I believe my mother worked in the palace. Years ago. Her name was Rena." The priest's eyes shifted. I believe I was born behind these walls," she added, louder this time. "I have a right to know." She didn't finish. A hand struck her cheek so hard she reeled backward. The High Lady herself, swathed in crimson silk and gold-banded sandals, had stepped forward from her entourage. Her eyes were flat and precise like sharpened stones. "How dare you accost a priest?" she hissed. "I didn't," Lima tried to explain, but guards were already closing in. She was reaching into his robes, the High Lady announced with a venomous smile. "I saw it myself. A filthy thief." "No, please, I was only speaking." "She lies," the High Lady snapped. "Tie her outside the gate. Let the city see what happens to liars." Lima screamed as they dragged her across the gravel. Her arms were yanked upward and lashed to a wooden post just beneath the palace arch. Her feet barely touched the ground. The sun scorched her skin. Dust clung to her lips. People gathered again, just as they had once before, curious and entertained. "She's back," someone muttered. "The mud girl again. Didn't learn her lesson, I suppose." This time, it was worse. Nobles in fine robes paused on their way into court and stared. One young prince smirked and asked if anyone had brought wine to toast her stupidity. A courtier whispered, "That child, she resembles someone, doesn't she?" But no one followed the thought. To question lineage here was dangerous. Bloodlines were buried beneath gold and silence. Lima sagged. Hours passed. Night fell. The wind shifted, bringing a strange scent, like burning cloth and rain. Then, footsteps. Soft, deliberate. Out of the shadows came a figure hunched beneath a hood woven from bark and smoke. The guards had disappeared for the night. The torches burned low. The old woman stepped closer and stared at Lima with eyes too white to see. "You are not meant to hang like this," she said. Lima blinked through sweat and blood. "Help me," she croaked. The woman raised a hand, palm marked with twisted lines. With one whispered word, the ropes fell slack. Lima collapsed into her arms. The woman reached into a woven basket and drew out a bundle of rags, tattered, patchworked, and strange. They shimmered briefly in the moonlight with threads that looked like silver spiderwebs. "Wear these," the old woman said. "But never throw them away." Lima opened her mouth to ask, but the woman was already walking backward into the night, vanishing between the trees beyond the palace walls. Lima looked down at the bundle in her lap. Something in her chest fluttered. The rags pulsed faintly in her hands, as if alive. She hesitated only a moment before stripping away her torn cloth and wrapping the new rags around her. They wrapped easily, molding to her body. Warmth coursed through her limbs. And then, voices. Soft. Whispering. Not in her ears, but beneath her skin. She staggered away from the post, the palace looming behind her like a ghost. The cloth tugged at her feet. She followed. Out of the city. Through the underbrush. Past the mango groves and down into the swampy forest where the elders said spirits walked. Her legs burned. Her breath grew ragged. But she didn't stop. The whispers guided her. Left. Right. Straight through the hollow tree. Across the brook where the water ran backward. The forest thickened. No birds. No crickets. Only the rustle of branches bending in the dark. Then, light. Faint and green, glowing from a break in the trees. She stepped into a glade. The air changed. The trees stopped growing there, forming a perfect circle. At the center stood a stone altar covered in moss and twisted vines, its surface etched with symbols older than the kingdom. Bones surrounded its base. Small ones. Animal, perhaps. Or not. The ground was warm beneath her feet. The rags pulsed again. Lima took one step forward, then another. She approached the altar, every hair on her body rising as the whispers in the cloth grew louder. This was not a place of prayers. This was a place of answers. And somewhere beyond that altar, something waited. The glade was alive, though nothing visibly moved. The trees around its border leaned inward as if listening. The air carried no breeze, yet the grasses near Lima's feet shifted in rhythmic pulses, as if something beneath the soil breathed in sleep. The rags around her shoulders tightened slightly, guiding her forward. She stepped closer to the altar, heart pounding against her ribs. The whispers in the cloth deepened, not words exactly, but sensations, like memory trying to form. She reached out to touch the altar's stone, cold and slick with dew, when the ground behind it split open with a low groan. From the earth, something began to rise. At first, she thought it was a mound of rot. But as more of it emerged, she realized it was shaped like a chair, no, a throne. Molded entirely from soil, vines, and writhing, living worms. Fat, pale bodies squirmed over its surface, and beetles crawled between crevices. The smell of fresh earth mixed with decay. She staggered back. Then the cloth around her waist whispered once more, this time in a voice she could finally understand. Sit. She trembled. Why? Truth must be earned. Lima looked at the throne again. The worms glistened in the low light, their tiny mouths opening and closing. The seat looked wet. Alive. Will it kill me? The silence stretched, then, only lies die here. Her knees shook as she took a hesitant step forward. Then another. She stood before the living throne and placed her hands on its muddy arms. It squirmed beneath her touch. She shut her eyes and lowered herself onto it. Pain erupted immediately. Tiny bites pierced her legs, her back, her thighs. She gasped, teeth clenched, as it felt like the creatures burrowed beneath her skin. But she did not rise. The rags gripped her shoulders tighter, holding her down, not to trap her, but to keep her still. Her breathing quickened. The forest vanished. And the visions came. At first, darkness. Then, a corridor lined with torches. Silk rustling. The scent of lavender. A young woman appeared, tall, proud, and radiant in a gown the color of embers. Her face was unmistakable, Lima's mother. But her eyes burned with a fire Lima had never known. Rena walked with her head high through the palace halls, servants parting before her. A crown of beads sat upon her head, and gold trimmed the hem of her dress. Then came shouting. Rena turned, defiant, as another woman stormed into view, regal, severe, and cloaked in green, the current queen, though younger. Behind her, guards carried scrolls, seals, and blades. You will not hide this child, the queen snarled. I did not hide her, Rena answered. The king knew. He chose her name himself. He chose nothing. He was weak, blinded by your spells, your beauty. But I am queen now. And no kitchen wench shall birth a rival to the throne. She is his daughter. You cannot erase blood. Watch me. With a signal, the guards seized Rena, stripping her of her crown. Her screams echoed as they dragged her out through the garden gates. The queen turned to a noble standing nearby. No one speaks of this. No record. No whispers. The child is to be discarded. If she dies, let it be from silence. The vision shifted. Now Lima saw a moonlit balcony, high above the city. The queen again, older now, her face pinched with suspicion. Before her knelt a young noblewoman, trembling. "Your Highness," the woman whispered. "I beg you, what I saw in the archives, her name, Rena, she." The queen leaned down. "Some truths," she murmured, "are too poisonous for even royal ears." And with a swift motion, the queen drove a dagger into the girl's heart. The noblewoman fell silently, eyes wide with disbelief. Blood pooled at the queen's feet. The queen knelt beside the body, wiped the blade clean on the girl's dress, and whispered, "No one must know." The vision cracked like glass. Lima's body convulsed. Her fingers dug into the armrests of the throne. The worms beneath her surged one final time, biting, burrowing, then went still. She gasped as her eyes flew open. The forest returned. The glade. The altar. The throne beneath her had crumbled, reduced now to loose dirt, crawling with a few scattered worms. Her body ached. Blood trickled from small holes in her legs and arms. But the pain was distant. Her breath was steady. The rags on her shoulders rustled gently, as if sighing. Now she knew. Her mother had not been a beggar. She had been royalty. And Lima had not been born in mud. She had been cast into it. By a throne that feared her. She rose slowly, fists clenched. And somewhere deep in the earth, something seemed to stir, something old, awakened. She did not smile. But her eyes gleamed with purpose. The first sign came at dawn. Lima awoke in the glade, curled on a bed of moss, her body sore but alive. The throne of worms had dissolved, leaving only a faint hollow where it once stood. The rags wrapped around her were different now, still tattered and worn at the edges, but threads of gold now ran through them like veins. They shimmered faintly in the early light, weaving themselves with each movement of her body. She touched the cloth. It was warm, alive. She felt it breathing with her. When she stood, the earth shifted beneath her feet. Leaves fluttered though no wind blew. From the treetops, a raven landed beside her, tilting its head. Moments later, two more followed. A jackal appeared from the underbrush, silent and thin, its ribs showing, but it did not bare teeth. It only watched her. A monkey chattered softly from a branch above, then dropped a mango near her feet. She didn't speak. But they followed her as she walked. The forest opened around her, trees parting in slow spirals. Vines uncoiled. Birds flew ahead, warning others of her coming. She passed through the thickets like a rumor through a crowded room, quiet, but impossible to ignore. She entered the first village at dusk. Smoke rose from crumbling clay huts. Children coughed by their doorways, and elders sat with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. A woman screamed when she saw Lima. "She's back. The rag girl, she's cursed." Others gathered, staring at the glimmering strands in her clothes. One man stepped forward, sneering. "You think golden thread makes you royalty? Go back to the gutters, mud." Lima said nothing. She only turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were calm, but they did not blink. That night, the man's house caught fire from within, though no torch had touched it. By morning, he was found crawling in the road, blind and shaking, mumbling apologies to the sky. The second village knew better. When Lima arrived, they offered water, fruit, and silence. A child with fever was brought to her on a mat. Lima knelt beside him, touched his forehead, and the rags around her wrist unwound and wrapped around the boy's neck like a scarf. The fever broke within minutes. The villagers gasped. "Who is she?" someone whispered. Another answered, "The forest's daughter." "No," said an old man, watching her carefully. "That is no forest child. That's the palace's sin." In the weeks that followed, famine struck the outer regions. Rivers dried, and crops withered beneath unrelenting sun. People starved. Chiefs hoarded grain. Merchants sold moldy maize at the price of gold. But in every place Lima walked, things were different. Her presence brought cool air. Old wells filled with clean water. A fruit tree, thought dead, bloomed overnight where she'd rested. She left no campfire, no caravan, no name. But in her wake, people ate. Children laughed. And the rags on her shoulders grew brighter. She never sought revenge, but it followed her like a shadow. A merchant who once spat at her feet suddenly found his tongue swollen like a gourd, unable to speak. A midwife who called her mother a harlot was found weeping uncontrollably, saying she saw a woman of fire in every dream. Those who had mocked the girl called mud now fell silent when her name passed through a room. They called her many things. The gold-tattered one. The weaver of hunger. She who walks with no dust. But Lima said nothing. She listened. To the trees that bent when she walked. To the animals that circled her. To the cloth that sometimes whispered when danger was near, or when a soul cried too loudly. Then one morning, while walking through a narrow valley near the salt caves, she came upon a group of starving men. Their skin hung on bones like drying leather. One of them, younger than the rest, raised a hand to her. "Please," he rasped, "we are scouts from the palace. Sent to map the drought. We haven't eaten in days." The others nodded weakly. She stared for a long time. Then reached into the folds of her cloth and pulled out a wrapped bundle. She placed it before them, flatbread, mango slices, salted goat meat. Food they hadn't seen in weeks. The youngest scout wept. "Who are you?" But Lima only walked on. The next day, that same scout burst into the queen's chambers, sunburned and trembling, with dust still caked on his lips. He collapsed before the throne. "Your Grace," he cried, "she's alive." The queen frowned. "Who?" "The girl in rags. She walks the famine like a ghost. They call her gold-tattered. They say she feeds the poor and curses the proud." The queen's eyes narrowed. Her hand tightened around the carved serpent armrest of her throne. "And you're certain it's the same one?" The scout nodded. "She carries the forest on her back. Even the earth listens to her now." The queen stood slowly. "Then she's become a danger," she whispered. "Shall I send guards, Your Grace?" the scout asked. The queen's smile was thin and cold. "No. Not yet." She turned toward the high windows and stared out across her kingdom. "She's coming," she said. "And she wants more than food." The sun rose slow and heavy over the capital, casting long shadows across the palace walls, where ivory and gold glinted like the teeth of a sleeping beast. On this morning, no one noticed the girl walking up the main road, her steps steady, her bare feet brushing dust off the stone path with every stride. She was draped in strange cloth, worn but regal, embroidered with threads of gold that shimmered like strands of light. Her face was half shadowed by a hood, and behind her trailed a silent procession of animals, a raven, a jackal, and a monkey that perched on her shoulder and hissed at anyone who came too close. People moved aside instinctively. They did not know who she was, but they knew enough to keep distance. Some whispered, "Is it her? The one from the famine?" Others simply bowed their heads, afraid to meet her gaze. At the gates of the palace, guards stepped forward, spears crossed, but paused. A steward stepped between them, bowed deeply, and said, "The queen awaits you, miracle girl." No questions. No searches. No laughter this time. They led her through marble corridors into the heart of the palace. Servants peeked from doorways. Courtiers paused mid-step. The girl's walk was not humble, nor proud. It was quiet, certain, and unbothered, like someone returning to a place they'd only borrowed in a dream. "She walks like someone who belongs here," a maid whispered. "Maybe she's from one of the outer houses," said another. "No," an older footman muttered. "She walks like someone who remembers." They led her to a chamber lined with purple silk and polished mirrors. A silver basin sat in one corner, filled with rose-scented water. Servants bowed and asked if she required bathing. She shook her head. I am clean enough. Word spread fast. The queen had invited the girl of the famine, the forest sent one, the gold-tattered healer. The high court gathered that evening, cloaked in jeweled layers and perfumed mystery, eager to see the miracle girl who had been whispered into legend. In the grand hall, where the ceiling opened to the sky and the throne stood beneath a great sun-shaped arch, the queen waited. Her face, though still poised, bore the marks of stress, fine lines near her mouth, a tension in her jaw. The drought had reached the capital now. Wells were low. Grain was being rationed. Disease crept through alleyways like rats. As Lima entered, silence fell. The queen rose. You are the one they speak of, she said. The girl who feeds where famine walks. The one who whispers and brings rain. You have done what my court physicians could not. You bring life. Lima said nothing. You are welcome here, the queen continued. Rest. Eat. My people may need your blessings. My kingdom needs saving. Lima stared at her. She knew her instantly. The same face from the vision in the forest. The same cold, proud voice that banished her mother. The same woman who whispered no one must know before drawing blood with her own hands. But Lima only bowed slightly. I will stay, she said, her voice even. For now. That night, she was given a chamber near the southern wing, closer to the royal gardens, where stars fell in quiet pools on the water's surface. Servants tried to engage her, but her silence made them uneasy. She walked the halls with bare feet, her golden-stitched rags trailing behind her like a train. Whenever she passed a mirror, she paused, not to admire herself, but as if searching for something behind the reflection. She ate little. Slept less. And on the third night, she rose after the torches dimmed, wrapped herself in her cloak, and moved like mist through the corridors. She passed by the guards unnoticed, the rags whispering softly, confusing footsteps, bending attention elsewhere. She entered the royal archives. The air smelled of leather and dust. Scrolls lined the walls like ancient serpents. Candles flickered as she moved down the aisle marked lineages. She found the shelf containing records from the reign of the former king, the man she never met, but whose blood thrummed in her veins. She traced the names. Queens. Concubines. Children born of them. Rena's name was not there. Not under servants. Not under noble guests. Not under palace births. She was erased. Lima stood still for a long time. Then, with a blade pulled from her sash, she carved a single line into the wooden shelf beneath the missing record. The mother you tried to forget. The daughter you never will. She returned to her room before sunrise. The next night, she walked deeper into the palace, past the guards who stood as still as statues. The rags around her shimmered more brightly now, no longer hidden threads of power, but open, undeniable light. She entered the royal chamber. It was a vast space, pillars carved with lions' heads, silk banners woven with royal suns. At the center stood the throne, high-backed, gold-framed, and encrusted with red jewels that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Lima approached it slowly. It was taller than she imagined. Colder. She placed her hand on one armrest. It did not respond. She leaned forward, her lips inches from the seat, and whispered. Soon. Then turned and walked away. Outside, in the gardens, a servant passing by saw her silhouette moving between torchlight and shadows. He ran to the kitchen, breathless. She went to the throne, he said, voice shaking. She? The girl in rags. The healer. She stared at it like it belonged to her. The kitchen maid paused, then nodded slowly. Maybe it does. The Feast of Blue Moons came once every decade, a night when the palace glowed in silver, when nobles from every corner of the realm wore their finest robes and jeweled masks, and when blessings were spoken over wine and meat for the next 10 years of rule. This year, it was different. This year, the air smelled not only of roasted goat and incense, but of something older. Something watching. The miracle girl had been invited as guest of honor. She entered not with trumpets, nor with the crowd's cheer, but with silence. The sort that drew breath from lungs. She wore her golden rags still, but tonight they shimmered like scales in candlelight, clinging and slithering with each step like they had minds of their own. Whispers passed among nobles. Why is she still dressed like that? Surely the queen has offered her silk. Perhaps she wears her power on purpose. The queen sat at the head of the banquet table, masked in courtesy but stiff in posture. She had not expected the girl to come so close to the throne. Not so soon. Not so bold. And yet Lima walked the length of the hall without flinching, taking her seat just a few chairs away, between two high lords who both shifted uneasily in their seats. Musicians played. Goblets were filled. Platters of honeyed fruits and fire-roasted fowl passed from hand to jeweled hand. Laughter returned. But every glance kept drifting back to her. Finally, after the wine had warmed the tongues of men, and the queen had raised her goblet to toast the girl of miracles, Lima stood. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something steel. "Before you toast my life, permit me to speak of it." The room stilled. The queen hesitated, but pride would not allow her to object. "Of course," she said tightly. "You have our ears." Lima stepped forward, to the center of the marble floor. Her ragged robe rippled as she moved, as if catching wind where there was none. She took one breath. Then another. And dropped the rags. They hit the marble with a wet sound, like hide, not cloth. And then they moved. Before the nobles could scream, the rags writhed and twisted on the ground, golden threads glowing, splitting into snake-like strands that curled across the floor in burning patterns, ancient symbols. A hush fell so deep, even the torches flickered low. "I was tied in these," Lima said, loud and clear. "Tied like a dog outside this palace, because someone feared what I would grow to become." She turned slowly, gaze sweeping the nobles. "My mother," she continued, "was once a woman of this court. A healer. A midwife. She bore the child of the king." Gasps. Choking sounds. Goblets dropped. Lima's voice sharpened. But she was not favored by the queen. Now all eyes turned. The queen's hand curled around her goblet. She was lured to the gardens with promises of safety. There, she was given poison wine, and buried before her child could open her eyes fully to the stars. Someone whispered, "A child." Another said, "No." Lima pointed to the throne. "I bear her blood," she said. "And his." The queen stood sharply. "Enough. Lies. Madness. Seize her." But no one moved. The guards who had stood motionless at the pillars now dropped to one knee, heads bowed. The queen's face paled. "What are you doing?" she barked. They did not respond. The torches flared. The great throne, carved from sacred stone centuries ago and touched by every sovereign since the founding of the kingdom, began to creak. A crack ran down its center with a sickening, groaning sound. People screamed. Others stood frozen. Lima stepped closer to it. "This throne," she said, "was forged to know truth from lies. And it does not know you." The queen backed away, clutching her chest. "No," she whispered. "You erased my mother," Lima said. "But the earth remembers her. You cast me out. But the wind knew my name. And this kingdom, this very stone, has watched every lie twist your tongue." The ground beneath the throne cracked wider. The queen fell to her knees, coughing. From her mouth came a dribble of black, thick as ink. "The poison you gave her," Lima said. "The blood debt returns." The queen let out a strangled gasp as her crown tumbled off, rolling across the marble toward Lima's feet. A silence fell again, deeper this time. The snake-like rags slithered up her body once more, clothing her not as a beggar, but as a sovereign of old, adorned in wild gold, in nature's thread and ancient truth. "I am no miracle," she said. "I am memory." And the walls of the palace shook. The rains had returned. Not in angry floods or violent storms, but in slow, gentle rhythms that fed the parched land. The rivers, once sullen and cracked, flowed again with song. Crops rose from the soil like blessings spoken in silence. And in the heart of the realm, where the palace once echoed only the queen's voice, a new rhythm ruled. They called her the Weaver. Not queen. Not prophetess. Not miracle. She had refused the throne. Instead, a new seat had been carved, simple but majestic, of dark cedar and stone, laced with thread-like carvings that danced in the morning sun. It stood above the throne, built into a curved arch of white marble that overlooked the palace courtyard and faced the people directly. And beneath her, where rulers once sat, the old throne served as a footstool. Each morning, she stepped upon it gently, barefoot, letting her heel rest against the cracked seat that once trembled beneath truth. A reminder. A warning. A story still being told. The queen had not died that night. Death, Lima knew, would have been mercy. Instead, at her whisper, the throne's final crack had split her down the middle, not to destroy her, but to reveal her. As the nobles and guards watched in frozen horror, the queen's body had stiffened, hardened, turned gray and unyielding. Stone, but lifelike, forever caught in the motion of collapse. Now, she stood at the very gate she once ordered Lima tied to. A statue. Eyes wide with silent scream. Arms curled inward, clutching a crown she would never wear again. No one dared touch it. Children passed it on their way to school and threw no stones now, only curious glances. Some whispered stories, some sang rhymes. One went like this. The queen turned stone, the throne turned low. But the weaver sits where winds still blow. She weaves the truth in gold and grass. And names the liars as they pass. The girl who was once filth and flies now wore no crown, no jewels. Just woven cloth, dyed in saffron and indigo, with golden thread still winding through her cuffs, thread she spun herself. She did not live in the royal chambers, though they were offered to her. Instead, she took a room by the tower near the garden, where her mother's tree had grown. Yes, a tree. The very place her mother had fallen, buried in haste and secret, had birthed a fig tree that now stood tall and bearing fruit, heavy and sweet. Some said the roots had whispered to the earth and called the girl back. Others said the tree had waited all this time to shade her. Lima often sat beneath it in the evenings, speaking to no one, yet hearing everything. The kingdom changed under her watch. Not through war or decree, but through weaving, as she called it. She rethreaded laws to serve the hungry first. She wove nobility from character, not bloodline. She unraveled old taxes meant to crush the weak and spun new ones to humble the proud. Foreign kings came to see her. Some expected gold. Others expected fear. All left with silence in their throats. And those who once mocked her, from merchant wives who turned their faces at the market, to high priests who called her cursed, now whispered blessings in her name when they lit lamps at dusk. Some of them confessed in tears. Lima never sought vengeance. But those who lied could not bear to look her in the eye. Something about her gaze unraveled the soul, thread by thread. One day, a young girl approached the palace gates. She held a worn doll in her arms and walked past the statue without fear. Lima was sitting on her stone seat when the child stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Your weaverness," the girl said, mispronouncing it. Lima smiled gently. "Yes? My mother says I threw a stone at you once. When I was little. Do you remember it?" The girl shook her head. "No. But I'm sorry." Lima nodded. "That is enough." Then, she leaned down and handed the girl something from her robe. A single golden thread. "Keep this," she said. "It remembers your apology better than I will." The child's eyes widened. She bowed again and ran off, clutching the thread like a treasure. The palace bell rang thrice that evening. A sign of peace. A sign that no judgment was needed that day. And above the palace, on her seat carved in quiet justice, Lima rested her bare feet once again upon the throne. The cracked stone felt warm beneath her soles. It no longer pulsed with lies. It had surrendered its burden. As the stars blinked open in the dusk sky, a servant near the steps asked her quietly, "Do you ever wish to sit on it? Even once?" Lima didn't answer right away. Then, softly, she said, "No. A throne holds a ruler. But I hold the thread that keeps the kingdom from unraveling." The servant bowed and stepped away. Lima sat still for a moment longer, watching the wind dance through the trees below. She thought of her mother. Of the garden. Of the moment her name had returned to the royal records, burned back in, not with ink, but with fire. And then she whispered the words that only the wind could hear. "If you tie truth in rags, it will return clothed in power." And beneath her feet, the old throne hummed quietly, like stone finally at peace.